you all so much for being here. My name is Raman Jit Singh. I work with an international NGO called Access Now. But before all of that, I'm curious. I wanted to ask, how many of you here think or would say that you work with information security, cybersecurity, digital security in any form? Just raise your hand. And be assertive and don't be shy. Like anyway, if you've submitted bugs or vulnerabilities or anything of that sort, or if you're thinking of doing that, raise your hand. So firstly, all of you will probably know much more than me, but the reason why I'm here partly is building on, in fact, what the last speaker talked about, the gap that sometimes exists between New Delhi, Bangalore, Pune, wherever you're coming from, and this sort of conversation around cybersecurity. Well, let me pause for a second. Why talk about cybersecurity and open source first? And in fact, I'd probably give a very personal story, because I'm originally a lawyer by training, which is why I tell everyone here that you probably all know much more than me. But in particular, what struck me is, as I've worked in the space of cybersecurity and digital security, for example, people asking, if I'm using an encrypted messaging platform, what should I use? What is safer, what's more secure? A lot of the people who work in cybersecurity often focus on the fact that we like to see things that are open, that are documented, that are discussed, and then we say whether something is safe or not. And in fact, when there are problems with systems or services, we often want to discuss that publicly, perhaps with responsible disclosure, perhaps through mechanisms, but we do want to put that publicly. There is essentially an open source philosophy that underpins a lot of what global cybersecurity work is, even if it's not always on just the cybersecurity of open source products or tools. And what's interesting to me is that when it comes to that conversation about what do folks in government, policymakers, and others do, there's a slight disconnect there. In fact, sometimes a very large gap. And I think it's very important to talk about it. What this session, and you can see, is called the Delhi Divide. The first way to figure out whether someone is from Delhi is they will probably not be wearing a t-shirt when they come to a conference like this. They'll be wearing a shirt. They will be talking a bit more about government and other things. But this title is not just baity or clickbait. It is here to mention that there is a divide that's not always intentional. And the fact that for example, you've had Mr. Abhishek Singh before this talk about what government is dealing in open source, is itself showing you that people can bridge these gaps. We can talk about what's there. What I want you to, in fact, to think about as you hear some of my concerns and flags is not just that this is something that shows there's a massive problem that needs only condemnation, it only requires lawsuits or Twitter take action campaigns. There are significant problems that exist in how your government, no matter which political party may be in power in Delhi, approaches the issue of cybersecurity and open source approaches. I worked in this space for a limited number of years, for around now 10 to 15 years, and I've seen multiple administrations deal with this issue. Different people in power in New Delhi, different state governments sometimes, and others as well. And there is a consistent disconnect between what people in New Delhi think of cybersecurity and open source approaches versus how you all in practice operate. And what I mean in particular by that is even in Delhi itself, I joke in saying the disconnect between the government zone in central Delhi and even people who do development of software work on cybersecurity vulnerabilities in Gurgaon, in Noida, or in Pune, Bangalore, Hyderabad, or wherever they might be, perhaps from their hometown or from their village, is significant. And there are a couple of common things here. What you need to recognize, and I want to throw this out there because I'll come back to it in the end, is that you can have an approach to cybersecurity policy, meaning what government does to frame how people should approach this issue and what government does itself, that can be individual and user-centric, it can be systemic, and it can be, in fact, something that's coming out of open, plural, democratic discussion. And I'll come back to the end because I want to give you a takeaway of what we can do next. But first, you need to look a little bit into the sort of headlines, right? Some of you who may follow the issues around digital rights, or just even are more specifically crypto geeks or encryption geeks. And crypto, I mean here in the classic context, encryption, not in terms of distributed ledger technology. You may remember back in around 2015, 2016, the Union government issued a draft encryption policy. What they said there was something that anyone who worked in security spaces was very concerned by. They said, oh, there's stuff here about making copies of keys available, plain text being made accessible, that we can never execute. It perhaps was also timed in an interesting and complicated way. The government issued this draft encryption policy document, and they withdrew it within just 2 or 3 days. They withdrew it as a draft document, which is also the government saying there's so many problems in it that we don't want to even consult on this. We need to do more work. Perhaps it was because it was at the tail end of a lot of activism that year, from the Save the Internet campaign more generally. Perhaps it was because the Prime Minister was making a visit to Silicon Valley, and he was worried about the perception it would give to others. But what you saw there was the government advanced something that even people who work with government or who might take even very careful conservative views said cannot in any way help the work of cybersecurity professionals in this country. It in fact makes our products weaker. Why was that there? That was there because, again, there's a particular philosophy in government that led to that. The other example I'll give you, which you've heard about perhaps more recently, is what some of you may regard as the VPN directions. You may have heard in the press, right, that the Computer Emergency Response Team in Delhi, the federal government cybersecurity institution, issued a set of directions under legal powers given to them by the Information Technology Act, which didn't just, by the way, target VPNs. They basically said anybody who is within the ambit of those rules has to do a significant number of things, including, for example, reporting data breaches within a very short deadline, keeping copies of records, which ironically would make cybersecurity harder by forcing you to retain data for years. And that's been something that the government, again, after a lot of outcry, has partly held back on. They said we're going to give several more months until those are implemented. But where did those directions come from? Why did it happen? And I'll come to that again in a little bit. You would have heard, for example, about hackers and folks who work on security research. When they've revealed bugs in government systems, they found, for example, vulnerabilities, or what they believe are vulnerabilities in the Aadhaar ecosystem. They found vulnerabilities in government websites and databases. You would have heard some of the stories, right? That they said, oh, we felt like government not only didn't listen to us, they threatened us. We sometimes got threats of legal prosecution, or we were told that what we did might be sometimes not fully in compliance with the law. And in fact, part of what they do might be sometimes in the edgy space of what's not easily always defined as legal under Indian law, because the law made by Delhi itself is so overbroad and so sometimes problematic. And all of these come from a certain basic thing, that the approach that people take to security and information security when you are in government is often different from what you all encounter here. Why I also wanted to talk to you about this is that the Indian cybersecurity community does more work often helping the world than it does to help India. And I say this intentionally, proactively, because if you go to any cybersecurity conference, the majority of people there will say, if you go to NullCon, if you speak to people here, if you go to Root Conference, what they will say is, yeah, most of the work we often do is for global bug bounty marketplaces. It's for global actors who work on wanting to discover if there's an exploit, a 0-day, or some other sort of exploit that's taking place. They pay us, they listen to us, we are encouraged to work with them. I, in fact, was very curious because a couple of months ago, there was a report published by New York University and a group called Data and Society that, in fact, and these are a bunch of folks in the US, a bunch of Canadians and many others, they said the majority of the world's bug bounty marketplaces, in fact, have Indians working for them or submitting vulnerability disclosures. People make thousands to millions of dollars through security research disclosure. And what is interesting is if you come to India and you talk about the number of cybersecurity professionals that are there or working with Indian companies or reporting bugs in government websites or vulnerabilities to the Indian government, it's much smaller. And there's a reason for that, because the ecosystem isn't necessarily conducive for them. And why that's the case is because people contribute and they help with projects because they feel motivated, which is again the reason why I wanted to talk to you all. People who work and do activity don't do it just because they want to be paid. They also want to do it for a sense of recognition, a sense of we have done something that actually has been addressed. We found something interesting. It's exciting to publish that, and it's exciting to see somebody act on our research, on our bug disclosure, fix that, whether they be in the private sector or whether they be in government. What you instead encounter, and this is not just in a sense a Delhi mindset or a mindset of the present government, it's a general governmental mindset in India that often people are trying to fix, and as you heard from Abhishek Singh and others, in fact within government itself often you can see parts of people trying to address or fix this. You see a couple of common approaches or tropes. One is trust me. If you come and talk to government cybersecurity officials or others, they will say what you're doing is absolutely correct to find out stuff, but don't criticize us publicly. Trust us to fix the problem. Trust us that we will act on it. Don't worry that we don't have a new national cybersecurity strategy. Don't worry that X government organization may not have an officer or even an ethical vulnerability disclosure policy. Trust us. And why is that a problem? Go back to the Cold War. There's a famous phrase that came up, especially in the 80s, between the Soviets and the Americans. They said, trust but verify. If something is happening, you want to make sure that actually it's been acted upon. Because it's not just best intentions. Sometimes people may intentionally not be acting on something. They may not be fixing a problem. Sometimes they may not have the resources to address it, or there may be other problems that are there. The additional issue on this is that when you look at questions about trust when it comes to cybersecurity, government, and FOSS approaches, you need to not just focus on individuals. It doesn't matter if they're one or two excellent officials or one or two excellent people who you know are trying to push government or others to be better policymakers on cybersecurity, better regulators or operators of cybersecurity. You need system-wide solutions. The first thing if you ever deal with government is, and you may know this, right? Who is the officer? Have they been transferred? Officers change. Elected lawmakers also change. Prime ministers, ministers change. All this occurs. So you need systemic solutions. And one of the problems in India that we often encounter, and the sort of Delhi approach on this is that they say, don't worry about the system too much. Let us fix that. Trust us that we will address it. And my first point here is we actually need a systemic solution. The reason why we also need a systemic solution brings me to my second point. Understand the role of government when it comes to cybersecurity in India. Government is perhaps one of the largest clients and operators of cybersecurity work. The government runs tons of system services databases. You have systems like India Stack that integrated a lot with government data. You have all the things you use today to pay tax, to book railway tickets, to do all sorts of things. The government also has incredible power, perhaps more so than private companies, because what do governments do, right? Governments regulate. Governments pass laws. And forget just passing laws or what happens in parliament, right? And for example, I want to flag, this is not a session to just beat up on things in Delhi. Delhi is very entertaining and incredibly complex and funny place. But this isn't about, for example, controversies in Parliament House, people attacking each other, their party lines. It is the fact that even a statement from government can shape policy in India. Today, for example, if the Minister for IT tweeted out one view about the open source community and infosec researchers, it doesn't matter what he may personally think or what his own office does. It sends a signal to everybody in the country. We are a country of over 1.3 to 2 billion people. You have so many state governments, but the second a signal is sent out by folks in government, it impacts the entire sector. And why I mean that is that what happens often on cybersecurity is you don't really see strong signals saying, we trust Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, when they come and tell us that there are problems in our systems. You don't see a signal necessarily coming out saying, we know that stuff is not perfect. We know that there are vulnerabilities in our systems. We want people to work more with us. That is something, for example, that we need to see change. Even when we're doing that, we need a signal that goes out there from Delhi recognizing that, yes, we know India's cybersecurity community services the world. We know that what we say on domestic issues impacts what a person's client in the US or somebody who's disclosing bug bounties to perhaps a Japanese telecom company, what they might be getting. It might be that if somebody says, we want a copy of every single bug disclosure report filed, that it's not just about the fact that they may not execute it. Somebody else in another country might say, of course your country will execute this, right? Why would a minister ever say something they don't mean? These things are important things that we need to recognize. The other thing there is what I want to talk about is what is the role of open conversation? And this is something that's very interesting, right? When you look at bug bounty programs, when you look at disclosure, when you look at the culture and philosophy of discovering problems in information systems, what most cybersecurity professionals say is, yes, there are moments when things may not be fully public. You may not be able to reveal every single thing, but in general, there is a bias towards revelation, publication, documentation, discussion. What, for example, one of the previous interjectors, or rather one of the previous questioners to Mr. Singh mentioned, right? Documentation is poor and needs to be worked on. Is something that's true in cybersecurity as well. When you disclose something goes out there, you want to be able to document and discuss what's there. And what many of you may encounter when you disclose bugs, especially in government systems to government, is that there's very little documentation. You might, if you're lucky, with some people get a disclosure that a bug report has been filed. You won't normally get live updates. It's very rare that documentation will be generally available later about the sort of attack that occurred there. What you need to therefore recognize is that there is a role for information assurance that needs to be existing. And what I mean by information assurance is separate national security, law enforcement from approaching cybersecurity. You need to recognize that if you have cops in cybersecurity, that can be a good thing up till a point. But you want people who are there to listen to what your community wants to do and how you want to approach it next. And I want to talk a little bit about what should happen next. We need to have a new converged conversation about cybersecurity and what are lessons from the open source community. I talked a little bit about being user-centric, right? We want cybersecurity policy that focuses on protecting users, recognizing that risk exists. You don't blame users, but you also seek to protect them. But you also want cybersecurity policy that protects you, because many of you who work on information security are the human beings of cybersecurity. There's a lot of global recognition in the last 2 years that we want cybersecurity policy that is human-centric. The first part of that, I would argue, is cybersecurity policy that encourages and protects the humans who make cybersecurity possible. Secondly, as I mentioned, you need something systemic. It can't just be individual officer or individual statement focused. You need a clear system out there saying, here is who is in charge of what, here's how we want to encourage the sector, here is what we want to see happen. 2 years ago, the Prime Minister on the ramparts of the Red Fort in his Independence Day speech said, we will have a new national cybersecurity strategy. That will be out in a few days. It's been 2 years later and I'm still waiting for that to come out. More importantly, when that comes out, it needs to perhaps be immediately updated by what you all want to see happen there. And that brings me to my last point, that you need cybersecurity conversations where when Delhi is setting this, these are part of open, plural, democratic processes. Open conversation is better than less conversation. For example, if you looked at the CERT cybersecurity directions, some of you might even be sympathetic to what government wants. You might say, Raman, I don't care that you believe law enforcement needs to be kept separate from general cybersecurity policy. But even there, perhaps they could have done it better. And if you looked at those directions, they weren't public. They were drafted in secrecy, quietly, and then published, perhaps, again, not intentionally, but because in government, sometimes when you set public discussions out, you're worried about how people will react. And you need to trust people. You need to be open and willing to engage in that conversation. And lastly, it goes to this point, right? Cybersecurity policy in India needs to recognize the open source dictum of contribution creation cultures. And in fact, I'm very happy and glad that Abhishek Singh from MIT and NEGD mentioned that, because that is one problem you still see here. This culture of open discussion, of documentation is something we need to see change and happen more. The idea of my talk was to provoke you to get strong reactions and hopefully for you to work with me, work with many other people who work on trying to shape what New Delhi, Bombay do on cybersecurity policy. So with that, I want to pause. I want to take questions. I want to take suggestions from folks. You can grab me afterwards in the hall track as well, anytime. But I just wanted to thank you for sparing the time and being here, and I'm all open to questions about this. And there is a gap between Delhi, Bangalore, Pune, and Hyderabad, but that gap can be reduced. To build bridges, you need to know what the gap is first. Thank you so much.
And thanks a lot for the excellent talk. So this is probably something related to how policies are made within the cybersecurity area. How often can statesmen and to be very specific, non-technical persons influence the cyber policy? Why I'm asking this is not to offend anyone, but the signal which you mentioned, statesmen posting, there was something which was regarding security. They said it is safe to run the So how often can a non-technical statesman actually influence the cyber policy?
That's an excellent interjection. For example, that person who said that it's actually a mix of a technical and non-technical statesman. That person is, of course, Mr. R.S. Sharma and his department. And that's somebody who is, of course, a civil servant, but actually a very technically solid civil servant. And despite the fact that I have very strong disagreements with him, I respect him from where he comes from. But in fact, that's the statement, right? You don't need to worry about telling people everything is fine. And why I say that is in cybersecurity, everyone knows this, right? Nothing is secure. Everything can be breached and targeted. There is no thing that if anyone comes and says it's 100% secure, that is a problem, because you're setting up an expectation and even a degree of comfort that's not okay. Even right now, I know everything I use, the systems of my organization can be targeted. So you need to say that. So in fact, perhaps it'd be better to say, I strongly believe in the walls around my entity, but if you find problems, come and tell me. and not come and tell me, here is the way to fix it. That's a sort of statesman-like symbol we need to send out there. It's what anyone would say in a good relationship, right? Disclosure of vulnerability is not a problem. Sharing vulnerabilities about yourself, even if you are government and cybersecurity, or if you're somebody's partner saying, I have problems, that is fine, so long as you link it to a systemic thing. And perhaps there we need these statements. We need these statements from our current IT minister, from the Prime Minister and others, because that's a useful signal. I've liked it that very former senior law enforcement officials in the US have come and said, we know everything is not secure. We know we need to do more. We need to work with you to do more, and we are ready and willing to listen. And hopefully we can get these statements out over the next few months to a year. But that's only if you all indicate to people, this is the effect of you not saying this to us.
I want to know if you are aware of active cybersecurity postures of the Indian government, and if that information is even available to the general public. For example, the CERT-In guidelines are more reactive, right? If something goes wrong, come and tell us. But what is happening actively from the government side? I have a follow-up question, but I'd like to answer this one.
Perfect. I'll try and be quick so you can ask that follow-up if you have time. There's a lot of activity for sure. One of the problems exactly, I'm in the same boat as you, is that the Indian government's not willing to write that down. And that goes to this trust us policy. When I say trust us, I've actually heard these words from others, so it's what you would say is like hearsay, but I've heard people hear from very senior people in government when they've come to them a few years ago, and they said, why don't you write down your new national cybersecurity strategy? They said, don't worry, we have a document. It's internal. We won't share it with you. And the reason why I said is not that I don't trust the content of it. I point out again, there may be bugs in every single thing that is there. My session proposal has a typo because I didn't share it with somebody before I sent it. That's the thing of sharing things with people. They discover vulnerabilities, right? And the other part of that is very important. People like me or even people like yourself might geekily follow this. It's not fair on anybody else to know about this stuff. Because if you're outside of Delhi, you won't often read governmental statements or pronouncements, or you won't get to know who to talk to. If it's public and out there, covered by the Times of India, in a short podcast, even memes are out about it, people have a rough sense about it. That needs to happen more. And in fact, that's why today, this National Cybersecurity Strategy document that comes out, when it comes out, is going to be important. But today, I have the open question. Do we know what are the military's postures? Part of it might be confidential, and that's fine. But I want to know roughly what are they doing, how much money is going in there, do they need more? Are there other people I talk to? Who in this constellation of activity that occurs? One anecdote I'll leave you with is, I have a colleague who works in telecom cybersecurity, and I asked him, if an incident goes wrong, how many people do you have to talk to? And he said, don't even start with me, because if I actually try to talk to everybody there, there's this like 10 organizations with different acronyms, and I don't know who to talk to first, who won't get upset, saying that, why didn't you come to us first versus the other person? And that's an example of us needing to fix and clarify things. But space for your follow-up question now.
This one is a little more technical, I guess, and it comes from previous work experience I've had with working with Government of India institutions. Some of the security instruments, I don't know the right word to use. A simple HTTPS certificate, right, used by government websites. They don't seem to be issued by entities in India or entities run by the Government of India. Do you think this matters to us in terms of cybersecurity, national cybersecurity?
For sure. I think the story matters, right? So for those of you who may find it funny, for a while, the website for the Supreme Court of India, its HTTPS certificate was issued by Let's Encrypt, which is a volunteer effort from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And it's brilliant. I love EFS work. We work closely with them at Access now. But one part of me was going was, this is quite fun because, if you ask the Supreme Court of India, are you trusting random hackers and digital rights lawyers in the US to write your HTTPS certificate? They would never say no, but their registry has done that. The reason that happens and why every Indian government certificate is either third party or odd, I say is not secure, is because the Indian government security certificates were actually downgraded by Google, Microsoft, and then by nearly everyone else in the space because of systemic issues with the issuance of those certificates. Now again, when I say Indian government, I mean the entire ecosystem. It's a good question about whether it's a problem with the controller certifying authorities or with MIT. Should CERT-In have done more? But there's a problem there, which to me is very interesting that years later has not been fixed because none of you know it's a problem. because you just know there's some issue there, but you don't know the backstory to it. And one other issue with not having open conversation is you don't fix things, right? It's like that old door in a family house that keeps banging, it's not fixed. And then someone says, how come? And no one talks about the fact that there's a problem there, or somebody broke it years ago and it needs to happen. So that's an example of something there where the backstory is important. If no other questions, I'm going to wrap up here, but I want to leave you with this thing. Please feel free to grab me and talk to me. As I said, policy making works on the basis of solid technical inputs and people understanding what the problem is. I can tell you today that even despite actively following this space, I don't know a shred of what you all encounter as problems. Please grab me, speak to me, please talk to others. And as Abhishek Singh and others showed you as well, right? Even when you find problems in systems, it's fine to have an open conversation in government. We need larger systemic fixes, but the first part is having that conversation. So thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to grab me. I'm here today, tomorrow. You can follow the work of Access Now online. And for those of you who like to, in fact, understand more about what the civil society and activist community feel or encounter in cybersecurity, visit our website and see the work of our helpline. We run a 24/7 digital security incident response team that does training as well in this space. So any of you who work on incident response or documentation, always good to speak with you. And we and other organizations are always hiring, not perhaps as much as some of the other folks who might be here, but we're always happy to speak. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much.